your mind, lost in
That worked for them, that existed before them, you know what I mean, but was part of their success.
You mean like the silent era of film? Oh, I love that.
Yeah, of course. And then of course there was theater before that, and yeah, I mean, how do we sort of look at each other? And this is something that I'm always interested in the movie podcast, is like, what are the universals? What is original to film and what isn't?
Ooh. Oh, I like
It's always an
that.
interesting
Okay.
question,
Yeah,
and
it
it's different
is.
with different creators.
Let me ask you this, though, because I'm always fascinated by this question. When you take a movie that's made with raw film, okay, you're talking about like 35 millimeter film, compared to a movie that's completely done in CGI. And let me ask you this. Do you feel that that film that's made with raw 35 millimeter film is more real, like more physical, than one that's completely done through a computer?
So
I don't know.
part
Weird
of
stoner question.
Well, okay, there's an example. There's a real life example that everybody will be familiar with, because everybody's got one. Everybody's either got the Baby Yoda T-shirt, or a little Baby Yoda doll, or a sticker on their car. Everybody's got a Baby Yoda something at this point, And as they were making Mandalorian, one of the things that was really important to them was to do real effects. Was to do it's called practical effects, which is that it's not CGI. And if you look at what they tried to do with a lot of the Star Wars sort of characters, especially in the early 2000s pictures that came out, it did not go over very well. Not everybody had the Jar Jar Binks t-shirt and the sticker on their car and the and the little character. And I
get
think
very angry when I hear that name. Okay.
I apologize for bringing that into
No,
your
it's
space.
okay. I was a kid that was like, went through with teenager, and I was like, if I hear that what is that thing? Okay. And then now, like, it's a Sith thing. No, absolutely not. Not accepting it. Done.
I think there's something to the and I think that was part of their decision making when they were coming up on these newer ones, and on that sort of series specifically, and especially with this character that they wanted to have it. They wanted it to sort of to be memeable the way that it became. And I think that the practical effects was an important part of that. And I don't really think that that's something that we can fully explain yet. I think that that is something about our sort of lizard brain and our facial recognition abilities, and just sort of how the brain works, that we can't fully comprehend or explain yet, but it is in play in film.
I always give this as a great example. A great movie to get stoned on is Batman. Okay. Tim Burton Batman.
Okay,
And
the Tim Burton. All right.
And the reason is because of so much use of practical effects, whereas with the colors, the shades of black, the costume designs, the lighting, the way that the film was I'm just giving that as an example, but like,
it's practical.
There's something so beautiful when you watch a film, and like, it's okay for it not to be 100% real, that.
Yeah.
But it's done well to a point that you accept it, because it's a great movie overall.
Well, and then there's something, we were talking the other day, I do a podcast called A Very Good Year that's about movies. It's part of my movie.
I love that title. A Very Good Year.
Thank you. And what we do is we have a guest. They pick one year. They pick their 5 favorite movies from that year, and we talk about what, like I do a news segment that sort of places the movies within the news, because movies are not made in a vacuum. Hollywood is a bubble, but it still exists on Earth. It still exists in the United States. So we do a news segment. We do a top 5 from the guests, their 5 favorite movies from that year. And then we talk about box office award winners, what won the Oscars that year. And then we sort of do a lightning round where we just list a bunch of other movies that came out in that one year. And it's a weird way to think about movies, movies, because you usually sort of put them together by genre or by director or something like that. You don't normally sort of, they end up being piled together in ways that you don't necessarily expect
Okay.
when you do it
I'm
that way.
I'm doing this because I'm very curious. One of my all-time favorite films, by far, I can watch the movie a billion times over. It's Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Okay.
My favorite movie, and it's just such a classic. And 1961.
Good call.
Okay, I didn't even realize this. I even searched this up. Another great movie that I love is West Side Story.
61.
Okay,
Yeah.
61. Such a
Yeah.
great year for such amazing film. The thing about films, and you notice, is the years that they're made in. Because the year that a film is made in can show you the type of attitude, maybe the ambience of artists at the time.
Yeah.
I love that dynamic. And as
Well,
a stoner, I'm just like, it's beautiful. It's so perfect.
and one of the things that ends up being sort of interesting about it, is the way that because a lot of people will do that, where they will sort of say, like, this is the movie that I want to talk about. This is my Breakfast at Tiffany's, whatever it is, right? And then they'll go and look at that year and look at the other movies from that year, and they will do exactly what you just did, where they're like, oh shit, I love this one and I love this one, and oh no, and so then we got to have them rank them, and they can't always rank them, and it's fun
There's more,
like that, right?
there's more. Oh my God, there's
Of
so
course
many
there
more.
is. and that's like such a what is also interesting is, you just mentioned putting them in we sort of think of film as having eras, and New Hollywood comes in 69, and sort of the 70s become their own thing. But one of the things that is sometimes interesting is movies that have come out in a year where you have an expectation about that year, but they break that expectation. And
I
that
think
happens in almost every episode, where there's one where you're like, what is that doing in 1944?
there are some great films that don't belong in their times. Like, there was one that I was
Well said.
watching, Magic. I think it's called Magic Mountain. It came out in
Yep.
1973. There, Orange is a New Clockwork is another. A Clockwork Orange, sorry,
Clockwork Orange,
it
yeah.
is another example. Like, these are okay. I try to understand this. When you watch A Clockwork Orange, you're watching it from 2023, like now.
Yeah.
Okay. Try to understand yourself. Like, imagine being in 1971, and sneaking out and going to see this movie. Okay? Like, this was not accepted. Like, this movie was very unaccepted by the public because of what it was. No one
Yeah.
did something like that, but people did. That's the cool shit about it when you
Yeah.
look at these movies.
Well, and that's Kubrick. That's Stanley Kubrick, who had put out 2001: A Space Odyssey not very long before that. And like, that's a movie that, like, you either love it or you don't. You
Love
either
it.
love it or you hate it. And
I
it's
love
one
it.
of those things that's just like, it's not made for everybody, and it's not one of those things that was obvious when it landed. Very similar to Clockwork Orange, which he did 2 years later. And he also directed Dr. Strangelove, and which came out, I think, in 64. He directed Barry Lyndon. He's a guy that, like, he just was, you never knew sort of what was coming next. You just knew it was going to be good. He did The Shining not long after that. I mean, for fuck's sake, like, yeah. And we
Another
talked,
level of a human. Literally another level of a human.
we did Clockwork Orange we did 71 and did Clockwork Orange on a recent episode. And, I watching it again, I was sort of, you always are sort of, when people talk about the movie, it's like, they either sort of talk about all the ultra violence and the sort of anarchy that's in the beginning of the movie, or they talk about, like, the heavy state repression that he goes through in the back half of the movie. And, that's sort of, it's one of those two things that seems to click with people. And when I watch the movie, and I forget this every time I watch it until I watch it again, is that the hinge point in the middle of that movie is him saying, yes, put me in the program. He asks for the repression. that actually comes down on him after that. And of course, maybe he doesn't know everything that he's got coming for him, but he does ask for it after his sort of period of anarchy.
He
And
does, yeah.
I think, that's an interesting thinking about, another thing that's happening in 71 is you're right after the 60s, you're right after the hippie era, you're just a couple years out from the Summer of Love. And I think there's a
Vietnam
real
War.
feeling, I think there's a real feeling of what is the blowback? And there's this fear that like, oh, these like hippie kids were having too much fun and somebody's going to have to pay for it. And I think that was one thing that we see in several of those movies from around that time. Drugstore Cowboy, or Midnight Cowboy, Drugstore Cowboy. That was 20 years later. Midnight Cowboy comes out around the same time, and it's sort of, there's, you have also, what's the Panic in Needle Park, where
Rocky Horror Picture Show.
There's several sort of heroin movies that
You
come
said
out around
Midnight?
that time. Midnight Cowboy.
Okay.
John Voight and Dustin Hoffman, really fantastic movie. And, I think there's a lot of sort of fear of like, what's the blowback? Like these hippies were having too much fun. These kids were burning bras and cards and everything. And that they can't just get away with that.
I think it's a really I think it's a really great example of, and I've talked about this so many times, there's sometimes a very dark light that's put on people that are Gen X and boomers because of the generations that they came out of. When we talk about these classic films that we know and love, there are people now that are alive, that are in their 70s. They love the Ramones. They are awesome people to hang out with, play billiards with. There are tons of those people out there. The problem is that when you have this overshadowing and overcasting, you tend to forget. So it's like these great films that were made by these people, they're alive right now.
Many of them are, yeah. Yep.
So,
and they're fucking kick ass.
Kick ass. Like they're right here, right now. Like they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So it's not necessarily about reminiscing about the past. They are a part of our future right now.
Well, and I think, I made a movie about the Attica prison rebellion that happened in 1971 that's on HBO Max right now. It's called Betrayal at Attica. And, that was a process that started with a woman that I knew named Liz Fink. And she was a radical lawyer, like super radical leftist lawyer, an absolute fucking badass. And she worked with the Attica brothers for many years. And she had 3 banker's boxes full of evidence that the state of New York has been saying for 50 years didn't exist. And she had it in her closet. And she had asked some other documentary filmmakers to deal with it. And everybody just sort of said like, oh, it's too much. I don't have time. And I just sort of thought that was crazy. She asked me if I would look at it. And I immediately took a couple hundred photos home and started scanning that night, because it was one of those like, this is our history. Like, I don't know what the fuck I'm going to do with it, but it needs to not just be in her closet, especially because the state of New York has been telling journalists for 50 years that it doesn't exist. So it does.
It's not the only thing that the state of New York has done, but yeah.
Right. So, I take that material home. I do her last 2 interviews before she passes away. And I made this movie that is almost, I didn't interview anybody else. I just made a movie out of the interview I did with her and the archive that was in her closet. And, I like it. I mean, other people like it. I don't know. I think it's good. It always sounds sort of weird to be like, watch my badass movie.
No, I mean, it's a really great approach to, like, this kind of reminds me of like the soft white underbelly. It's where you create a documentary of a story told by the person. So the person is your representation for the next hour. It's a different way of a documentary. Sorry, but I kind of like it. I think it's a more simplistic approach. Maybe sometimes keeping it simple maybe is better.
I'll tell you what I like about it. I like the idea. And Errol Morris is one of my favorite filmmakers. And he made like...
We're all about the artist. That is the whole purpose of this podcast, period. And, you have a really valuable tool. You can share this with artists, people that are creative, someone that can enjoy this podcast and really enjoy the experience of Lost in the Groove. So, with that, let's jump back to today's episode, shall we?
He made Hearts and Minds, like the movie, the Robert McNamara movie. He made
Oh,
he made known
okay.
he made Known Unknowns, the same movie basically, but with Donald Rumsfeld. And he's a person who does this where he will only have one person talk. And there's another one of my very favorite documentaries is called Heaven is a Traffic Jam on the 405.
Oh
And
my
it's like
God.
maybe 15 minutes or something. It's a short doc, but it's with this lady who has a very particular sort of speech. It's not really an impediment. It's more of a pattern, but it's very particular and unique. And it takes you a couple minutes to sort of lock into the way that she speaks. But as soon as you actually touch base with her rhythm, you just rock with it. And I really like that, where you can just sort of lock in with a person and you just hear the story from their perspective. But what you were saying about these people are alive and we can talk to them, after I made that movie, the year after the movie came out was the 50th anniversary, or right around when the movie came out was the 50th anniversary. And I ended up getting involved in a 50th anniversary commemoration committee. And we had a whole thing in New York and da, da, da. But as a part of that, there were a dozen Attica brothers that were coming around. And then after that became the Attica Brothers Foundation. And I started working with the Attica Brothers Foundation. And so now I'm working with Attica Brothers. And these guys are all universally in their 70s and 80s. But these guys have been working in the Black Power movement now for 60 fucking years. For 70 years, they've been working in the Black Power movement. These are guys that went and heard Malcolm X speak on Lenox Avenue in the 60s. And they have these memories. And there's this, in 2020, a lot of sort of people became aware of of the racist foundations in history, and sort of and it became aware of identity politics in a new way.
Well,
And
the realization also is we as artists have endured, and I'm saying this personally, have endured an immense amount of suffering because of greedy corporations that care more about money than they care about the arts and film. We know this because artists used to control until, unfortunately, it went the opposite direction. They
I
became the
mean,
corporation.
I think, it's like it's easy to feel like every generation has to reinvent the wheel around this stuff. And I think every generation does have new perspectives that are valuable, but there is a lot to be learned from these old movies, from these old projects, and from these creators, and from these people who've been fighting this fight. And I think that, it's the it would serve us all to sort of be able to study that stuff in a little bit more respectful way than a lot of times we do.
Yeah. I think it's also like being able to like come into place, like kind of like realize that can't change the past. You can hear it,
Yeah.
listen to it, you can watch it, learn from it. Don't have to make the
Yeah.
same mistake twice.
Do you like I've also found in doing the movie podcast, watching a lot of old documentaries is something that, like, because I like documentaries, but I sort of see them as they come out around things that I'm interested in or filmmakers I already like. I don't necessarily just sort of, you see a movie and you're like, oh, I like Kurosawa. I'll watch this Kurosawa movie I've never seen. I don't necessarily, but I've been
I
watching a
like,
lot of old documentaries for the show.
yeah.
And I've found myself really digging into, because their stories are being told in a completely different way. Styles have changed a lot, but the humanity is there.
Yeah, it's just a different lens.
I watched a movie from, I think it's 79 maybe, called Truth Is Out, or no, 1977, called Truth Is Out, where they interviewed 27 people, gay men and lesbians, about the sort of struggle that they had been through leading up to that point. And I mean, you can like you could smell the coffee in the shots. Like you feel like you could bum a cigarette from the people that they're interviewing. It really feels like the humanity of it. And this is now almost 45, almost 50 years old. And the humanity of it is just so immediate and present and accessible.
Yeah. And it's sometimes a reminder of maybe ask less. Just ask less. Expect less. And maybe instead, in return, look at peace. Look at ways of bringing people together, not dividing people. Because what those people had to go through in 77, I mean, because, gay discrimination, quote unquote, was, made illegal in the country in 1970. That was 7 years earlier. So if you're dealing with people that are in their 20s, you can imagine that for most of their life, it wasn't, it probably wasn't peachy and roses by 1977 either. But I'm just saying, like, just
People
to
weren't
the
getting arrested outside of bars and having their picture in the newspaper.
exactly.
Right. Well, and I think like that's, it's, I don't know. I have enjoyed sort of, I also, I met another lady. I live out in Portland, Oregon now, and I work with a group called Don't Shoot Portland. It's a anti-racist peace group, peace activist group, do all kinds of community work and mutual aid stuff. And they're great. It's fantastic. And I met a lady through that group who was part of Freedom Summer, like was part, was in Mississippi in 63 trying to register people to vote and getting chased by the Klan. It's a white lady, who's like, and to, that's pretty deep in the weeds. You know what I mean? Like there weren't a lot of white people in Mississippi in 63. Like she was one of a small handful. And to listen to her and to hear her have the same sort of level of passion and dedication now that she did 60 years ago is a remarkable feeling. And there's also a sort of feeling of like settle in, of sort of find the work that you can do that is sustainable for you, and settle in. We are not talking about movie podcasts anymore. We've gone, that's just how your podcast works, isn't
This
it? I
is
was
how the
listening to the
podcast is.
Oppenheimer episode today.
Mm,
And
oh, really?
that's how your podcast works, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much it is. I mean,
I love it.
I I really try to just blend a level of figuring out where we're gonna go is not the answer. I think just learning and kind of understanding and learning new things, like kind of what you're doing yourself, taking a year and dissecting it and learning something from it. The thing about past, future, present, history, movies, it's all what inspires people to come together and talk.
Yeah.
If anybody's watching this, not this. Not this. It's not how we communicate as human beings. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think there's something to, how is it that you can still watch Fatty Arbuckle movies and they're funny? The sort of silence and stuff like that, right? Like, how is it that that stuff is still funny? There's something universal there, right? That is not just sort of throughout the history of film, but is actually probably, hundreds of thousands of years old, right? I mean, when did we sort of start laughing at like farts or people falling down or whatever? I mean,
Greece. I mean, I think it's before then, but the idea of entertainment and media is shown throughout histories. I mean, Romans were notorious for this. They had Colosseum, they had auditoriums. The Greeks were known for this. I think the Babylonians were also known for it as well. There's always been a spark of creativity and a wanting of entertainment throughout history, and I think it's because it makes us happy.
my
You know?
favorite theory for the cave paintings, you've seen the cave paintings, right?
Oh, they're
Okay,
beautiful.
so my favorite theory for the cave paintings is the idea that what they would do is they'd gather in the cave and they'd start fire. They'd start a fire in the cave, and that the flickering light would basically sort of make the paintings, would give the paintings motion.
You mean like use their
And
hands?
no.
No hands.
Just the flickering light of the
Oh.
fire itself would
Okay.
make the way that the animals and everything is painted. It would give them motion. And then and this is of course all theory, right? There's no
I
way to
love
sort
this.
of work it
Who
out.
cares?
But
love
I
this.
love it, right? If it's not true, it should be. And then
Yes,
they
it
would,
should.
they would sort of stand between the fire and the paintings, and that's one of the theories about why the paintings are actually up higher on the wall as opposed to, sort of right immediately where it would be easy for them to paint, is because that way their shadows, their sort of body shadows would be cast along the wall, and they could actually have more control over the shadows that were dancing over the paintings.
Crazy.
Like, if it's not true, it should be. I just love, I love the idea. And that's like, I mean, literally, man, like we've just put fire in a little bulb and we're making the shadows run around in front of it. I mean, it is really actually in a lot of ways the same thing.
If you were listening to that episode, Mike brought up, we're having a lot of mics. I love this. It's great.
There's a lot of us.
Keep it up. But he said that I think he was in Florence. He said that he saw, which, dude, I don't know if you've ever been to Italy. I was in Rome. I could literally stare for hours. The architecture is just another level. But he was saying that he saw we're on this pillar. They had the artists were on top of the gods.
Uh-huh.
And in kind of an interesting way, it kind of makes sense. I mean, what sparked creativity, what sparked civilization, what sparked artists, creators, Not some dipshit didn't say like, "Oh, triangle is great for cars." No, some guy's like, smooth, round.
Right.
You idiot! What do you mean smooth and round, you moron? Turns out he was right.
Right. I think it's not like that's sort of the that like did God create man and did man create God sort of idea.
Maybe
like,
God is artist. Maybe God is the representation of art.
Okay, there was one time though that I was at the Grand Canyon on mushrooms, and I was like, if I had 1 billion years and an unlimited budget, I could never make something this amazing. Right?
It's
Like
impossible.
I mean that idea of the creator as artist.
Dude,
there's
that
a long
is-
history of that too,
That is millions. If you go to the Grand Canyon, you are looking at millions and millions of years of layers of the earth stacked on top of each other. That, my friends, is evolution at its finest.
And if you had the same amount of time and an unlimited budget, could you create something as good? And it's not even like could you create something? It's like it's the sort of the fine detail, the way that it's amazing on an incredibly micro scale and as macro as your eyeball can possibly like process. I mean, that is what I'm talking about. It's not just sort of the craftsmanship of
It's a
it.
visual
I couldn't have an idea that good if I had 1 billion years.
It's a visual interpretation, of history.
It's a good place.
Bro,
It's a good place.
like it goes to show you, it really does, that for something like this to exist, for us to be in this universe that has all of these laws of physics and rules, why?
Well,
Why?
This is
Crazy.
my favorite thing about people. So there's a great story. I think it's Battle of Salamis, which is one of these Greek stories about when they're fighting the Persian Wars. And there's a guy, Mithridates, who I believe that's his name. I might get his name wrong.
That's fine.
But it's there's this sort of the Persians are there, and Athens has a navy, and he thinks that they should go that Athens should go and attack the Persian navy, and everybody's scared to go attack the navy. Everybody's nervous. And so he sends one of his runner dudes over to the Persians and tells the Persians that the Athenian navy is going home, that they've decided they're not going to have this fight because they're in this little bay, and the Persian navy is much, much bigger than the Athenian navy. So that's why everybody's scared to go fight them. But he knows that if he can get them in this bay, that takes away their advantage of size and that the Athenians will win. And so he sends his guy to go tell the Persians, they're leaving, you should come attack now. And so the Persians all float bring their navy into the bay. Well, now that they're in the bay, the Athenians have no choice but to attack them. And it's this great sort of story about this one guy who's just ornery as hell, and he's just sort of like working the system, and he's got somebody, and he's just sort of whispering in the right ears. And all of a sudden, it works. It happens, and they come out and they beat the Persians, and it's basically the last time that the Persians tried to take over any of the Greek lands whatsoever, right? And the fact that the Athenians won that battle was based on one guy kind of being a dick, kind of had an idea and kind of forced his hand on everybody,
That's how the way the universe works, my dude.
But it ended up working. And I think that there's something, that is sort of, in a weird way, that sort of unpredictability is actually the most interesting thing about human beings.
It is, and I think the realization we as humans, and something I've kind of learned this along the road, especially with cannabis, is just go with the flow. Like, people interpretive of like, oh my God, he's so stoned he can't think. No, it's the realization that I don't fucking control the universe. Okay, I'm me. If I decide to be here, I'm gonna be here. If shit happens, I gotta deal with it the way that I'm going to be able to deal with it. And that's that. Because we spend so much time of our lives worrying and fixating on, I need to, plan this moment to this Stop doing that. Just stop. Just stop. I mean, like, you're a filmmaker. I mean, my God, you're in an industry that is an example of, you say 9 o'clock in the morning. No, everybody's there at 6, or sometimes, depending on the day, everybody's there at 12, or maybe they're there at 9:30.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So
depends on the day. That's part of what's good about the job.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that I also try to sort of keep myself open as far as projects go. Like, I don't necessarily even want to schedule exactly what thing I do, what genre I work in. Like, I made the movie about Attica, and I've done a lot of criminal justice work and stuff like that. But I'm also right now making a movie about the video store era, and sort of, all the filmmakers that came out of the video store era. And then what happens when we get the first like real master filmmaker who grew up on YouTube? Like, what does that look like? In the sort of way that Tarantino is sort of seen as like the ultimate video store master, the sort of DJ of genre. What does the first YouTube master look like? I don't think we've seen that yet, because I don't think that person is old enough to have had their opportunities yet.
Well,
I mean,
YouTube is only going to be, by the way, it's crazy. YouTube is about to be 20 years old in 2 years.
Right.
Isn't that crazy?
That's just what I'm saying. In another like 5 to 10 years, we're going to get our first YouTube master. Our first like master filmmaker who grew up on YouTube and doesn't know fuck all about a video store, and has been to the theater but didn't need to, which is, the sort of the idea of being able to access, you're watching movies on YouTube now more and more often. You can't actually see the whole thing, especially if you're looking at silence, if you're looking at older films and stuff, you can actually get the whole thing. But for a long time, YouTube movies were 5 minutes of Gator or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't really a place where you could actually do cinema studies. And now I feel like it is, and I'm curious. So anyway, but we're doing this video, we're doing Very Good Year now. Jason, my co-host on that show, before we did this one, we did a show called Fun City Cinema that was about movies that are made in New York. and he's an author, and he wrote a book called Fun City Cinema, covering 100 years of movies in New York. And this idea that like even a narrative film shot in New York is sort of an accidental documentary, because the city's always changing around you. It's
Right.
very hard to control streets, to like lock down a whole street where there's nobody on it. That's not a paid extra. You can get away with it. Some people can get away with it, but it's not easy, so it's sort of,
There
so
was
we made that.
there was a film, I don't remember the name of it. Maybe it was Once Upon a Time, but I remember I was watching. They literally used old footage
Mm-hmm.
in the actual production because, like you said, you can't shut down the whole block, and somebody already took a really. I was really surprised. Like there are people that took really good quality shots of like Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens, like even outside of the city. Like we're talking about like good quality photography, like in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very hard to tell if you put that in a period movie now.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
is that like a thing that they're doing now, especially like in films?
Well, there's more and more often you're seeing like 4K upgrades of this old material. And so in order to do that, you have to actually rescan the material. So it relies on, having the actual film reels. So, you're not going to see it for everything because some things only exist on VHS at this point. If you do a 4K upgrade of a VHS tape, you can put it in your 4K movie, but it's still going to look like VHS, right? You're not actually improving on the quality. Whereas
Well,
you can do a 4K scan of an original film print, and you can actually get a 4K image
what?
out of that print, because
No
that print,
way.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
crazy.
Because that
What?
print, and so any sort of digitized versions of that print at this point are going to be VHS, or at max they're going to be 1080. Sorry. At
So
max,
we
they're gonna be 1080.
okay, so what you're saying is you need like the original, like even. I mean, if you get like a negative, if you get I mean, you
Mhm.
could still be able to develop it, but that's amazing. Can you imagine that having a piece of film that's 57 years old
Mhm.
and you can make it into 4K?
Yeah, 100%.
Crazy.
And I think what they're
Whoa.
doing, I think a lot of times when you see those things, they're cropping, because you don't necessarily have like that perfect 16:9 box or whatever. You know what I mean? So maybe these old films are shot on 16 or something. My brother's fucking killing.
Well,
Maybe
okay,
these old
so
things are shot on 16 or something, and so they're more of a 4x4 or a 4x3. So I think they're sort of cropping a lot of times to get that image, but the scan itself is 4K.
let's think over here for a second. Like 1960s, 1970s. I mean, a lot of people were using like Super 8. That was like most common. But we're talking about professional. You're saying that most people are using 16 for like
No, professional. I mean, professionally, most people are using 35, but that depends on what, that sort
what
of
rig they
depends on,
had.
yeah, it depends on what they had. And also a lot of time, but this is the thing. No matter what, whether you're using 8, 16, 35, 70, because remember in the 60s, there was a lot of like CinemaScope and shit, right? Which was like these super widescreen formats and things like that, right?
Really cool. They're
Really
really,
cool.
really cool. I have two of them.
Whatever sort of film strip you're shooting on, that film is going to be a higher resolution than do you understand what I'm saying? Like the
Oh
the
yeah, of
film
course.
itself, like once you
I collect film cameras and film.
see,
I have yeah.
so it just depends on the scan, in the same way
Yes.
that like if you're printing those film prints, if you want to make a poster size joint, you got to get yourself the medium format, you got to get the bigger body film. But for the most part, you can scale your prints if you're shooting on film, even if you're shooting, sort of like regular, one at a time 35 or something. It doesn't have to be fancy cameras. You can scale your prints, and it's a similar thing with the digital scans now.
Well, the really cool thing was I saw, they have like these really cool like these YouTube channels, and one of them I was watching. They took a piece of film and they took a microscope and they zoomed into it, And the really interesting thing about, which I noticed like with film is, I don't even know how to explain it. It's like circles, it's like a color on top of a color. And then as you zoom out, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So kind of like almost reminded me of like scales of a fish, you know,
Yeah.
kind of in a way of like how when they're processing this, the chemicals that they're using, it kind of like goes over a certain way and
It creates
manages.
layers.
Correct. Yeah.
Mhm. It's layers of the different chemicals.
Hey, it's Dave, and I quickly just wanted to jump in and say if you've been enjoying the podcast and enjoying this episode, if you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that'll be so greatly appreciated. Because here's the thing, someone might read that review and make the choice if they want to listen to the podcast. You get to help grow this podcast with us. How fucking cool is that? Let's jump back to today's episode. Like, rub your finger on an old photograph. Like, I have a bunch of these. They're not smooth.
Right.
They're not
They have
smooth.
texture.
Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. I have I still have 2 cans left. I bought one time in New York I found a bunch
35
of
millimeter?
old black and white 35 from 1981 that wasn't exposed. And so when I go out and shoot with it, like, you'll get, half your images maybe will expose and sometimes even less because it's almost 40 years old at this point.
Best
But
plated.
when
Best
it does
plates.
expose,
Yeah.
they have texture.
They do have texture, but you know the really cool thing to do with exposed film, like non-exposed? I mean, it's expired at this point. You know how you have like those awnings? If you have light that shoots through and you have like those wood pillars, because it's expired, I mean, you're gonna have a lot of bleeding, but what happens is with wood, because it blocks out the light, it kind of creates this like skeleton. So you can create like these skeleton pieces. Like,
That's wild.
yeah, like you do with trees, you could do it with awnings, you could do it with signs. I've seen some of these pieces and I'm like, I want some expired film. I want to try this.
When you find it, I don't see it very often, but I try to grab it when I do.
It's
I have
really
a picture of my
expensive.
wife in a kayak that I
Ooh.
shot on that black and white where she's on a lake and there's mountains in the background and shit. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it's just sort of, it's perfect. And it's not even like, you put it in a fucking competition, or it's not like, I'm not trying to suggest that anybody else needs to care about it, but it's what pictures look like in my head. You know what I mean? Like it is the perfect sort of photograph for the way the world looks to me. So, okay, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
There's a very exciting thing that happened with my co-host this week, and I'm curious if it got outside of our little universe. You've heard about this guy David Zaslav, who is running Warner Discovery. Have you heard about this?
Let me.
Okay,
Zaslav? You gotta speed me up on this. Okay.
I'm gonna catch you up. Check this out. This is you will enjoy this story, I think. This guy was running the Discovery Channel. He took over the Discovery Channel, and he's the one who turned the Discovery Channel from the Discovery Channel into like, look, like these fat people can't get up off their couch. Like, let's all gawk at them, right? He's the one that turned Discovery into that. Okay?
Oh, okay.
So then Time Warner merges with Discovery, and now he is running both companies. So now he's the one that like canceled the Batgirl movie for a tax write-off and stuff like that. So already people are annoyed with him. Well, now he's running Turner Classic Movies. Okay, he's in charge of Turner Classic Movies. And one day, 2 weeks ago, he fires 30 of the 50 people that work there, including, the sort of top people, and including the programmer, the guy who has been programming TCM for 15 years. This guy Zaslav fires him. Okay. Now, the movie business loves TCM. My parents also love TCM, but the movie business loves TCM.
There's
right?
classics. There's
well, and also they show them without commercials. They show them with context. They interview people about them. Like they really do a great job of presenting cinema, right? Film, these old movies. So the day after this guy fires half the people, there's articles about, Steven Spielberg called him and was like, do not fuck up TCM. Okay. And there's articles about this guy fielding phone calls from Scorsese and Paul Thomas Anderson, all of
Oh
these
my
people who are
God.
all mad at him, right? Okay. So now, a week later, GQ hires my co-host, Jason, to write an article sort of summing up this whole adventure. What's happened with Zaslav, right? Well, Jason writes for Vanity Fair and New York Times, and like he's a proper film critic. Like he's, but he's also very good and doesn't hold his tongue for anybody. He's a very sharp sort of critic. And when he likes it, he will heap praise on it, but he's not afraid to, to bite if he doesn't like something. So he writes this article for GQ about this guy Zaslav. They published, they from what he told me later, they already dumbed it down before they put it out. Then they publish it, and this guy calls GQ and says, you have to take down this article. And so now my co-host gets a call from an editor much higher up the chain at GQ and says, we want to change all these things. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay. Now,
Whoa.
like I said, he's got some, he writes for some serious places, but this was the first time he had ever written for GQ, right? And like GQ publishes weird movie articles. Like they are willing to publish sort of, what happened to this one lady who was in this one movie,
You mean like, for example, what was that? Elemental, that one that Disney just. Anyone that wants a good laugh, go read it. Go read
That's
it
the one.
and weep. Yeah, it's good.
So he was excited, to get to start writing for this place that does weird things, And so, but then when they call him and they tell him we want to change all these things, he says, I'm not doing that. Which to me, I think is a hard thing to do. And the guy says, okay. And then, the editor gets off the phone, makes all the changes himself, and then just republishes the article. Well, now Jason calls him back and says, hey, like, that's not what I wrote. Take my name off of that. Right. Which, like, we're talking about sort of commercialism and, sort of corporate culture. And we all know about, access journalism, and not saying sort of mean things because you're never going to get to talk to that guy again and all this kind of stuff. So I think for him to call this editor at GQ and say, take my name off that shit you wrote is nothing to sniff at. Right. And so the guy says to him, we don't publish articles without a byline. So then GQ kills the article completely. Well, now, of course, everybody who hasn't been on these phone calls, which is everybody in the fucking world except Jason and this one editor, thinks they took it down because Zaslav told them to. Now they think that and so then what we find out actually even after that is that the editor who took all the stuff down actually has a production deal with Warner Brothers right now to make a movie. So he
Lord Jesus,
he particularly
dear
didn't
Lord
come out looking
Jesus.
good on the other side of that, right? It's just like
Fucking
it's
yes.
such a stupid story. It's
So
such a
fucking
ridiculous, stupid story. But also, isn't that exactly how you think it works? It's one of those like it confirmed so many of my bad suspicions.
You know what's so fucked up is people forget it is one of our amendments is like freedom for the press. I mean, my God, why is it so fucking hard for a journalist to write some fucking shit that is not been spit at by Fox or CNN? Okay, write some real journalism. I want to hear your opinion. I don't give a fuck about Tulsi Gabbard's opinion. I don't give a fuck about Tucker Carlson's opinion. I don't give a fuck about anybody's opinion. I want to hear your opinion as a journalist. Like, you're a filmmaker. Is your job to make sure that the woman that picks the fabrics No, your job as a filmmaker is to take care of film. That is what you do. That's your craft. When did we be okay with this idea of like, nope, we don't do that anymore, but we're still journals. We're still journalists.
Well, I just, I think I was really, I was not surprised, but it's always nice when you see your friends, sort of be able to walk with integrity, and it's not a surprise, but and I think like
That
he's
show
somebody that
that shows true journalism.
I know I mean that's what I mean. Like when you see, when the guy says he likes something, he can tell you why, and he can explain it to you in a real way. And when he says he doesn't like something, it's not arbitrary, you know.
You don't need to change the words to make them more fancy.
And then you know what I said to him, because I was not paying attention to this shit. I was busy, and then I sit down and open Twitter after my kids go to bed at night. And Jason, and I see he's having an adventure on Twitter that day. Sort of everything that's going on, and lots of people are tweeting about it. And like one of the old New York Times critics said, "This is the only time I've ever seen every film critic agree on anything."
Oh my god.
And so of course I called him and I'm like, "Hey, are we going to do a special episode about your adventure with Zaslav?" And he said, "Fuck no, we're not going to do that." It was immediately like, "We are not turning this show into me complaining about this asshole. We are doing the show that we do." And I was like, "See, that's what happens when you have integrity."
Bro, I'm telling you, like, I am so tired of these people that are really like trying to like ruin Hollywood. They're like forgetting that artists made Hollywood.
Okay, but let me give you a different perspective on this.
Okay. All right, I want to hear your different perspective.
It both will make you feel worse and better at the same time.
Okay.
That's how you know it's true. Which is that from the very beginning, film has been an expensive medium. It's been expensive and it's been, complicated. It requires a lot of people. And there has never been a moment in the entire history of that industry that it wasn't a commercial enterprise. There are occasionally filmmakers who can figure out ways to fund things that are not commercial. You look at Tarkovsky or something like that, like he's not necessarily concerned with, not every Antonioni movie was meant to be a blockbuster, right? There are people who figured out ways, but part of being a successful filmmaker has always been making your money back. It has always been a commercial endeavor. It's always been expensive. There's always been some asshole at the top who is trying to tell everybody what to do. Just the story of The Godfather is just such an amazing story where like Robert Evans is showing up every day. Like, why is it so fucking dark? It's like, please get him out of here. Please get him out of here so we can just make our movie. Like, Coppola had to fight tooth and nail. They didn't want to give him any of his casting choices. Like, just the story of The Godfather itself is an incredible microcosm of the way the film industry works. And that sucks. And that sucks. There's no doubt about it. And it sucks for me personally. Like as a filmmaker, it sucks for me to have to sort of think about, the first question anybody asks is who's the audience? Well, fucking, I don't know, people with good taste. That's not what I'm thinking about, right? But inside of that thing that I have just told you is every artistic thing that's ever been made within the film industry. Because at some point, the people who have the money don't have the art. And they know that if they're going to make money, they have to hire an artist and to some extent leave them the fuck alone. And we go through these cycles in the film industry where there's more corporate control and less corporate control. That's the big story of New Hollywood and, 1969 and the sort of the movies that started coming out around then.
It was a different, like,
especially the box office had completely collapsed and they're spending money on these huge musicals. What does that sound like? It sounds like comic book movies. They're spending money on these massive, massive productions.
You're talking about now.
Well, I'm talking about, yeah, but I'm also talking about musicals in the 1960s, right? Like that's the point, is that these things go through cycles and they were making these big, huge musicals. And at some point people stopped going to see them. And at that point, the people who were running the movie industry decided that they didn't know what people wanted to see anymore. And that's what gave us the 1970s. The same thing happened again in the 80s. We go from Look Who's Talking To Pulp Fiction. in like an extremely short amount of time because they were making these big budget movies and then people stopped going to see them and they started giving money to lower and lower sort of people who've now, now you've seen all of those people rise through the ranks. And I think we are back in that cycle. It's been sort of prolonged and broken a little bit by like Netflix and, sort of the streaming services that have injected some new and exciting and interesting things into it.
And
But even at this
independent
point,
artists like creating
but even
series now. Yeah.
well, and that's what I mean is like, through sort of some of those streaming services that came along, some people got opportunities to do things who wouldn't have gotten opportunities in the sort of stratified film industry of even 2010, 2005. Right. And
Yeah,
so I think
100%.
so I think the streaming services have actually sort of broken that model and that narrative a little bit, but not ultimately. I think we're in that process, and comic book movies now are the movie musicals at the time. Every now and then one comes out that's pretty fucking good, but for the most part they're mid. They're 60 to 70s, they're not really sort of 90 to 100 in the ratings. And then
Okay, but
at some point people are going to stop going.
La Machina. Oh, bro.
Is it more powerful than it was when there were 3 television channels and movie stars were like the most important people on earth? Movie stars are still important, but we can't understand how important they were in the 60s. I'm not disagreeing with you at all. Like, I agree with you completely. I'm not sure that they are more powerful now than they were then, or even as powerful.
No. I'm talking about, what's his name? Bert Kreischer.
Okay.
He came out with a new movie. It's called, he calls himself The Machine.
Okay, you're talking about a specific dude. I thought we were talking about like the Hollywood Machine.
No.
Talk to me about the Machine.
Oh my God. So first of all, like, we haven't had a good like comedy movie in a good couple of years. We haven't. There hasn't been really like a good. This comes along, bro. There is cursing, violence, sexual assault. You name it. Everything is in the movie. It is. I think it's called Bert Kreischer, The Machine. And it just gives me hope. It does. It gives me hope. And like you really.
Oh, I know who this guy is. I didn't know he had a movie though.
Yeah, a movie. I watched it in theaters. Bro, everybody was stoned there. It was hilarious. I came into the movie theaters. The second the door closed, the lights went off. Everybody's vape pens went off. Like, there were green lights shining all over the movie theater. It was amazing. It was so... But those kind of things, like, exist now, and I think that exists now because of the accessibility of social media and the accessibility of being able to create these films that we haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah. I'm here for it.
Oh my God, I love it. So
I gotta go feed my kids. How long does your show usually go?
Usually an hour. Yeah. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah, we're almost at an hour.
I can hear my wife right outside my door trying to negotiate with the children to leave her alone.
Oh my God. Dear
stop
Lord.
bugging her about dinner.
Dear Lord.
This is what reminded me. I apologize for interrupting.
No, you're fine. No,
you
you're
look
good.
You look like you had a question. I just had a moment of like, I just had like sort of a married person's like check in.
It's like, my
Sorry
kids.
about that.
No, you're good. So let me
You look
ask.
like you had a question though.
I don't remember.
Fair enough.
No. Stone brain is just like right past me.
It's not a stone brain. It's a galaxy brain, man. This conversation has gone, all the way out to space and back. You're processing a lot right now. I know I am.
I will tell you this. I really believe in this ideology of where you can make any type of podcast or film you ever want. But if it's not genuine to you, why would it be genuine to anybody else?
Hear, hear, my brother.
So, for anybody that managed to get here at this hour, where can they find this awesome human being over here? Where can they find your films? Where can they find you?
I am on Twitter at brainwashedlib, and the show is called A Very Good Year, and my movie is called Betrayal at Attica. It's on HBO Max, and it is going to be arriving on other streaming services very soon. We're still on HBO, but I think we've reached the end of our exclusive contract with them, so we can start throwing it up in some other places. And yeah, just I also do produce a podcast called Black Diplomats with a host named Terrell Starr, and I don't actually speak on that one. I talk on Very Good Year. I don't actually speak on Black Diplomats, but Terrell is a genius. He's a black dude from Detroit who speaks Russian and lives half of his life in Ukraine, and is just generally a fascinating and incredible human being.
Whoa.
He's a foreign and nuclear policy specialist.
Whoa.
And so we were doing a lot of work around Eastern Europe anyway. He already spent half his life in Ukraine for several years now. And then obviously once this invasion started, it really sort of took on a new sort of urgency.
Yeah. So
he's on, if you've seen a black dude on MSNBC talking about Ukraine, it was probably Terrell. Like, he's on CNN and stuff like that, sort of doing spots from over there. And so that's a completely different sort of vibe and a totally different style. We have a series that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks called Liberating Iran, where we were doing something about the JCPOA, the Iran deal, the nuclear stuff, which is something he talks about anyway. And then we sort of had this moment where we were like, I don't actually know shit about Iran because I live in America and everything I've ever heard about it has come from American news. Right. And so we're doing this series now called Liberating Iran, where we interviewed six people over, but they each person has their own episode. There's a married couple that are in one episode, but they are all from Iran. One of them, I think, is first generation American. And so, we're trying to talk about Iran from the Iranian perspective, and it's sort of recognizing that, like, yes, I'm American, but like, I don't like hardly anything that my government does internationally. And it's sort of trying to provide Iranians with the same respect, to say that, you can be alive there and not necessarily agree with everything that's going on around.
Something they've been fighting for a really long time. And it's really, it's really important for people to have voices. It's really being able to give over those experiences. And if you like what you like, be sure to like and subscribe.
Hey, nicely done.
And if you want to check out more of the podcast, you can find us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at Lost in the Groove Pod. So, with that, we'll catch you in the next one. Stay cool.